Happening, folks? Every month, I'm going to do a deep dive on movies that are important to movies. It can be innovative or controversial or just wildly successful beyond its box office figures, which don't really mean anything anymore anyways, thanks to Hollywood going all weird.
With so many recent movies wasting our time and money, I'd like to use these episodes to do my part in making sure the great movies never slip into the darkness. During my spoiler-free review of Renfield, I'd suggest that I could probably count the number of horror comedies to get the tone right on one hand.
Yeah, boy!
And I was politely reminded shortly thereafter I'd forgotten to include a very special movie on my list.
Stone Commander? You were absolutely correct, and thank you for keeping me right. Today's movie is a cult classic, and it happens to be one of my favorites. And if my terribly cheap wig isn't making any sense to you right now, I will assume you haven't seen the movie yet. It has exerted a profound and enduring influence on modern horror movies, and I have nothing bad to say about it. So if something feels weird or different about my presentation today, it's probably just the lack of under-the-table jibes.
Return of the Living Dead's a horror comedy written and directed by the late, great Dan O'Bannon. Dan passed away in 2009 after leaving his name all over the movie industry with writing and co-writing credits for movies like Dark Star and Total Recall, and a tiny little number you may have heard of called Alien. Return of the Living Dead, which I'll refer to as Return from here on in, is a loose adaptation of the novel Return of the Living Dead by John Russo, who co-wrote the screenplay for the original Night of the Living Dead movie, which is the 1968 George Romero movie that popularized what we now know as zombie movies.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
And Return stars
Tom Matthews, Linnea Quigley, Brian Peck, Clu Gallagher, James Karen, Don Catha, Jonathan Terry, Alan Troutman, Beverly Randolph, Jules Shepard, Miguel Nunez Jr., John Philbin, and Mark Venturini.
And that's not even including the zombie hordes.
The movie's endured as a cult classic because of its innovative mix of horror and comedy, its biting social commentary, its contributions to zombie lore, its impressive practical effects, and its influence on popular culture.
It essentially created a new template for zombie movies that fans of the undead are still entertained by today.
It was also a critical and commercial success.
Yeah, a zombie movie. It earned over $14 million in the box office in 1985 bucks.
Critics loved its self-awareness and the way it took zombie lore and horror comedy in a new direction, all on a budget of $4 million in 1985. And yet, in 2013, on a budget of nearly $200 million, Brad Pitt and his cronies managed a lukewarm critical response despite having Max Brooks' brilliant novel as source material.
I've tried reviewing World War Z several times here on YouTube, and Paramount always seems to slap a claim on me. Yeah, that Paramount. Gross profit of $10.3 billion in 2022, and they want my $4.78. Let me walk you through Return's plot, and I will impart everything I know about this movie. And by the time we're done, your brain will be spilling over with all kinds of yummy, juicy, ultimately completely useless trivia. Without any further delay, ladies and gentlemen, 1985's Return of the Living Dead.
The movie opens on July 3rd, 1984 in the UNITA Medical Supply Building.
As you're about to see, one of the themes explored in Return is the consequences of scientific experimentation. That theme is reflected in the movie's use of a poorly managed medical supplies warehouse as a setting.
We meet Freddy, played by Tom Matthews, his boss Frank, played by the late James Karen, and Frank's boss Bert, played by the late Clu Gallagher. Freddy's just started working at UNITA and they're wrapping things up before the 4th of July weekend. They kick things off by packing up an order for a human skeleton, which is very subtle foreshadowing. And then Frank shows Freddy around the place, and amongst the stock, some not so subtle split dogs and dead bodies. And then we meet Freddy's girlfriend Tina and her friends Casey, Scuzz, Spider, Chuck, and Trash. And they can't figure out what they're doing that night, so they decide to hang out until Freddy's done work, because Freddy always knows where the party is.
As the story progresses, you will also see an exploration of the inherent conflict between authority figures and rebellion. This group of friends are painted as the outsiders, but they're also the first to take things into their own hands, while the military, the government, and the police are completely ineffectual at cleaning up their own messes.
Back in the medical supplies warehouse, Freddy asks Frank the weirdest thing he's ever seen coming through the place. So Frank tells him a story about a top-secret project in which the United States Army developed developed a chemical that inadvertently reanimated dead bodies. When Freddy calls his bluff, Frank takes him downstairs to the basement to show him one of the actual corpses. When the nervous Freddy asks if the canisters leak, Frank introduces us to one of the movie's pioneering elements when he boasts about the skills of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
The movie depicts incidents of government cover-ups and bureaucratic mishandlings and military incompetence, and it does it in a very satirical tone, but make no mistake, it is a direct critique of all the American authority figures in the 1980s.
The canister bursts immediately with just a modest tap, and the gas escapes into the rest of the building during the opening credits. And although we're only 8 minutes into the movie and we've just spent a couple of minutes with Freddy and Frank, we fully understand their situation. As characters, they're both sympathetic and well acted, and that makes it funnier when the incident highlights the obvious military incompetence.
We're laughing at the absurd nature of what happened, but we're also kind of concerned because both of the characters are really likable. At least right now they are.
Then we're introduced to the military element through Colonel Glover, who's just come home from work in a miserable mood. The colonel has to check in constantly so his superiors know his exact whereabouts. They've been searching for the missing gas canisters since they were delivered in error to the Uneeda warehouse in Louisville, Kentucky. And in another subtle dig, the situation's got Colonel Glover and his wife constantly at each other's throats. Meanwhile, the gang's been picked up by their friend Suicide, played by the late Mark Venturini. While they're waiting for Freddy to finish work, they decide to kill some time in the Resurrection Cemetery, which just happens to be right next door. And once they're inside, Chuck flips on his ghetto blaster for the first of many times, and this brings us to another of the film's innovative elements.
Return's soundtrack was unique for a few reasons. It blended punk rock and new wave and death rock and psychobilly songs from groups like 45 Grave and The Damned and TSOL and The Flesh Eaters and even The Cramps. If you're not familiar with any of these names, that's because they were underground bands. And given conventional horror music at the time was traditional orchestral scores or synthesizer tracks, the use of this raw countercultural music gave the movie an authenticity that would play a huge role in its eventual cult classic status. And it wasn't just that they stuffed the soundtrack full of rebellious music. If you go through each song one at a time, every single one of them relates to death in some way, and each of them was placed at specific points throughout the movie to enhance specific scenes. If you've seen the movie, whether it's your kind of music or not, you can't argue. It really works. Surprisingly, YouTube won't let me play any of it for you, but I have linked the entire soundtrack down in the description. Try throwing it on sometime when you fancy a boogie while you're vacuuming.
We go back to Freddy and Frank as they're regaining consciousness after the leak, and they look awful. And the tank's empty too, and Frank figures the body's been locked up so long it probably disintegrated when it hit the air. And they make their way upstairs for some fresh air, and they're immediately drawn to a strange sound, which ends up being whimpering from one of the reanimated split dogs. While Frank's having a meltdown over it, an even louder noise pulls them away, and it ends up being screaming from the body in the freezer. So they lock the freezer door and call Bert the boss. Back in the cemetery, Trash tells Spider her fantasy about being bitten to death by a pack of old men.
You heard me right. Her fantasy about being bitten to death by a pack of old men. So 1985.
She gets herself so worked up over it, it results in a scene that's lived on in infamy for nearly 40 years. I'd love to show it to you, but you know how it is.
Linnea Quigley plays Trash, and if you're a horror fan, you're probably familiar with the name. Linnea was 27 when she played Trash, and she'd already done 19 movies before it. And keeping things family-friendly, I'll just say Linnea made herself a career out of being comfortable in her own skin, shall we say. And to this day, she's still very active at horror conventions and enjoys a legendary reputation amongst die-hard horror fans.
When Bert gets back to the warehouse, he tears the ass out of both of them for messing with the barrel. They all agree to keep things quiet so Bert's business isn't affected. The first job on their list is taking care of the screaming body in the freezer. In a panic, given the unprecedented nature of their problem, the lads form an elaborate, grisly plan based on the events of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead.
Directly referencing George Romero's 1968 movie attributes the existence of zombies to that movie's events. That creates a fictional world within a fictional world, and that means the narrative is self-aware. 11 years before Scream came along and invented the idea. And to drive the self-awareness even further, the character's awareness of previous zombie movies becomes a plot device. They try to apply their knowledge of what happened in Night of the Living Dead to this situation, only to realize those tactics aren't going to work in this movie, which adds an additional layer of commentary to the subgenre itself.
The instant the freezer doors unlock, the yellow zombie heads straight for Bert. When they finally subdue it, their plan to destroy the brain falls apart and they're forced to accept Romero's rules aren't working here. And in another display of self-awareness, this happens.
I thought you said if we destroyed the brain, it'd die. It worked in the movie! Well, it ain't working now, Frank. I mean, the movie lied!
As horrifying as this scene is, it's also freaking hilarious. As per Tom Matthews and James Cameron's stellar performances. The tone was so perfect, it opened the floodgates for a whole subgenre of zombie comedies, like Shaun of the Dead, or Zombieland, or Dead Snow, to name a few. All of which incorporated humor and a self-aware, irreverent approach.
When faced with the reality they can't kill the zombie, they decide to cut it up and take the pieces around the corner to a crematorium run by an old friend of Bert's.
And this decision marks the first major escalation in the plot. It's a logical decision despite the illogical situation, and that is very important in story terms. But I'll come back to this later on.
We meet Ernie the mortician, played by the late Don Caffa. He runs the crematorium and he's inspired today's set. In a very subtle way, Ernie explains the process of rigor mortis, and we're shown a fantastic bruise on the abdomen of a dead man. And both these pieces of information are setups for later on that don't feel like setups. When Bert fails to convince Ernie the bags are full of rabid weasels, he finds out the truth, and the truth nearly bites him in the ass. Back in the cemetery, Freddy's girlfriend's getting impatient and she tells the gang she's heading around to see where he is. But Freddy's with the boys in the furnace room now, as Ernie's agreed to help them out by burning the remains. And Frank drops another subtle setup with this comment.
Some big favor. I could operate that goddamn thing.
The act of burning them sends the chemicals up through the chimney and out into the open air.
I mentioned earlier the first major plot escalation was their decision to burn the remains. It was logical, and it's one you could probably see yourself making if you were in their situation. And it sounds like straightforward cause and effect, because it is. And that is a huge reason this story works as well as it does. I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, but a lot of modern horror writers tend to overcomplicate things when they're plotting their stories. A good plot is actually a simple thing. It's a series of events, one leading naturally into the next. And now that I've mentioned that, you'll see how Dan O'Bannon and John Russo have a really firm grip on the concept of ramping up the stakes as you get closer to the final act.
The rain comes down hard and it brings the chemicals back down with it. And that drives the gang running out of the cemetery with burning skin, and Freddy's girlfriend Tina into the warehouse. And right as things are starting to get animated in the cemetery, Suicide's car won't start. That means they're stuck there too. And Freddy and Frank's health takes a turn for the worse when Bert tries getting them up to go to the hospital. And that causes Ernie to phone the paramedics to bring them to the morgue.
The simple, logical, and straightforward progression of the events continues, and they're written so well, they crank up the tension by removing options for each of the groups of characters while simultaneously forcing all of them into the same place. And this is also simple and logical, you barely notice it. But if you do pay very close attention, which is what I do constantly, you'll see that there aren't 20 seconds in this movie that aren't revealing character or moving the plot forward.
While Suicide and the gang are trying to figure out what to do, Casey hears something she can't quite place. The camera does a slow motion climb over the graveyard and you can hear screaming cadavers beneath the soil. But the gang writes it off as rain hitting the roof. Back inside, Tina heads down to the basement to see if Freddy's down there. And he's not. But something very significant is.
The zombie Frank and Freddy released from the tank did not evaporate in the air, it reanimated and escaped. And just like the yellow zombie, it walked right past both of them. And this terrifying thing represents the first ever fast-moving, contemplating, brain-craving, cunning zombie in horror movie history. And its iconic design and unforgettable performance makes it an instantly recognizable symbol of the Return of the Living Dead franchise. It's made appearances in merchandise and comic books and other media, and to this day, nearly 40 years later, Tarman, as he's known, is nearly as iconic as Jaws. Depending on the circles you travel in, of course.
Without any other options, Suicide and the gang take cover from the rain in the basement with Tina, and they get there just in time to save her, but the diversion they provide costs the aptly named Suicide his life. While they're trying to keep Tarman contained, the paramedics arrive at the morgue for Frank and Freddy. It turns out the zombies keep bypassing them because they're already dead. After they nail a basement door shut, Tina and the gang, minus Suicide, sprint to the morgue, and most of them make it. Turns out Trash's death fantasy isn't half as appealing in real life. Casey and Chuck get forced into the medical supply building, and Spider, Scuzz, and Tina make it to the morgue, where they update Ernie and Bert about the hundreds of zombies coming out of the ground in the cemetery. And as Tina's finally reunited with Freddy, Ernie heads outside, but before he can even get to his car, he runs into this iconic imagery. And he's forced back inside to lock down the morgue. They can't call the police because the phones are dead, so they barricade all the doors and windows while the zombies outside are impersonating paramedics requesting more backup.
Send more paramedics.
Once they're safely inside the morgue, they try figuring out what the hell's causing the bodies to climb out of the graves. But it doesn't occur to them they've released the toxin into the air when they burnt the yellow zombie. When Freddy describes his symptoms, they show the bruising on his back, and we know what that means because Ernie explained it to us at the start of the movie.
Subtle. The way exposition should be delivered in a movie.
The zombies find weaknesses in the building, as they always do. While they're defending the front door, Scuzz gets too close to the action, and we're introduced to even more iconic imagery in the form of this beauty.
By comparison to every previous zombie movie, the animatronics and prosthetics in return set a new standard for undead movies.
This gorgeous half-lady corpse tells them the zombies crave brains because eating them eases the pain of being dead. And this is game-changing. Firstly, we're presented with an entirely new species of zombie. Instead of lumbering around aimlessly, hoping to sink their teeth into something close by, these ones are purpose-driven, ravenous threats to your existence. And on top of that, it brings a new level of depth and humanity to the zombies. They're no longer just reanimated corpses. Instead, they exist in an agonizing state stuck somewhere between life and death.
Isn't that exciting?
Based on the information the half-lady corpse gives them, the lads resign themselves to the idea they can't kill what's already dead even if they dismember it. Meanwhile, Trash, although still completely without clothing, is now one of the zombies, and she has a very unique look. Back in the morgue, the fellas think it's best if they move Frank and Freddy into the chapel so they don't hurt anybody if they make the switch. But Tina, being a devoted girlfriend, decides to stay with him.
And isn't that nice? My ex-girlfriend wouldn't come over if I had a cold.
So the police eventually pull in when the paramedics haven't reported back, and by the time they arrive, the zombies are organized and hungry for brains. So the cops are done before they even get started. Back in the chapel, Freddy passes away in Tina's arms, but he comes back immediately, and he wants Tina's brains. Unfortunately for her, again, the rest of them come to her rescue, and Freddy's face is doused in acid. But that only slows him down a little bit. Spider and Bert make it to the running police car, but they can't make it back, and they can't escape either. So they beeline it back to the medical supplies warehouse with Chuck and Casey, where there's a phone in the basement. While Freddy's tearing the place apart to get to Tina's brains, Frank pays off his earlier setup when he does, in fact, turn on the incinerator and climb inside it to spare himself an otherwise inevitable fate. Tina and Ernie barricade themselves in the roof to keep Freddy away, while the rest of them take Tarman's head off so they can get at the phone in the basement. But the zombies take the police out while they're on the phone with Bert, leaving them no choice but to call the emergency number on the empty tank, and the call gets routed back to Colonel Glover. The Colonel enacts a contingency plan for just such an occasion, and right when Bert and everyone else is starting to see light at the end of their tunnel, we're given the bleakest, most nihilistic ending imaginable when the government nukes Louisville, Kentucky to keep the outbreak contained. And the movie ends with Colonel Glover assuring his superiors everything will be fine now, as the heavy rains are going to wash everything away in the aftermath. But we in the audience know that's not going to be the case.
And there you have it. A funny, scary, intelligent, critically and financially successful zombie cult classic that still stands up nearly 40 years after it was made. If you've seen it, let me know what you thought about it down in the comments. And if you haven't seen it, I suppose you don't really need to now because I just spoiled everything. And thanks again to Stone Commander for this episode's movie recommendation. And coming up next, Brain Dead, as recommended by Mikey Thompson. Until next time, folks. It's me, Johnny, from that video you just loved, and I know you loved it because you're still here, and seeing as you are still here, you should probably go down there and smash me in the face to subscribe, and seeing as you just smashed me in the face, you should probably do something nice to make up for it, like maybe watching this next video. Do it!